I'm going to take a punt and say I reckon you have heard of Moby Dick. In fact, I would wager, if I was to ask 100 strangers just to name a random book from history, at least more than one of them would name it. I think its status is that strongly established. And just to set the stage for today's video, I would also wager that it's probably one of the first books that comes to mind when people talk about classics that actually live up to their legacy. I'd say none of that is hyperbole. Moby Dick genuinely is just that good. I remember first reading it and being kind of shocked at its inventiveness, its originality, its ridiculously poetic and quotable language. It was the same feeling I had when I first read Shakespeare. So with all of that in the front of our minds, I would also wager that most of you do not know that Melville had quit writing prose altogether by the time he was 40 and then spent the next 30 years of his life dedicated to poetry, chiefly to a single epic poem which is likely the longest in American literature, Clarel, a poem and pilgrimage in the Holy Land. He saw this poem as the fulfillment of his literary gifts and in many ways as the conclusion of his life's creative and spiritual ambitions. So despite the weight that Melville gave it, for my final bet, I would guess that most of you had probably not heard about Clarel until today's video. In which case, today on Out of the Page, I want to discuss Clarel, the forgotten epic, and discuss the question, can we choose our legacy? First of all, of course, very quick background. Herman Melville was born in 1819 and died in 1891 at the age of 72, both in New York City, USA. He went to sea at 20 years old on merchant ships and saw the islands of the South Pacific, which inspired his first novels. His first two books were published in his late 20s and were adventure stories based on his experiences at sea. They were wildly successful, but his writing style matured over his next three books and his audiences fell away. He spent 1.5 years then writing Moby Dick, which was published in 1851. Along with his next novel, Pierre, it was panned by the critics of the day. He'd begun to weave psychological and philosophical discussions into his work and was fairly experimental in how he structured them, and the result was basically the end of his life as a writer, and he quit prose altogether in 1857. By 1866, he'd taken a job as a customs inspector, which he kept for almost 20 years. Clarel was published in 1876 to essentially zero attention or sales, and by the time of his death, very little interest in his work remained outside of literary circles. The so-called Melville Revival began in 1919, 100 years after his birth, and his reputation skyrocketed throughout the 20th century, and now, rightly, his greatest works have taken their place in the Western canon. Now, onto Clarel itself. Anyone already familiar with Melville's writing will tell you that his relationship with faith and religion was complicated at best. In the winter of 1856, Melville traveled for 2 weeks to the Holy Land and visited many of the sites associated with the life of Jesus, such as Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The next year, he published his final novel, quit prose, and decided to dedicate the rest of his life to poetry. However, 2 years later, in 1859, a book was published by an English biologist that would effectively change the course of human history. That book, of course, was On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. So for some historical context, Melville grew up in a day and age where the traditional foundations of Christianity and Christian thought dominated much of Western society. But when Darwin was able to explain evolution by means of natural selection, it shook the religious and scientific worlds to their very core. From Melville's trip to the Holy Land in 1856 to when Clarel was first published 20 years later in 1876. An age of naturalism and biological science dawned that to so much of the world, Melville included, resulted in a fundamental crisis of faith. And that, if I could summarize it into a single sentence, is the plot of Clarel. In a few more words, the poem is about an American theology student named Clarel who travels to the Holy Land to try and renew his faith in Christianity. He explores the old city in Jerusalem, sees historical sites, and meets a large cast of characters of all different faiths, almost all of whom are having similar questions about their own beliefs. Clarel falls in love with an American tourist named Ruth, but after the death of her father is unable to see her for some time due to Jewish customs. To pass the time, he takes a trip into the desert with a number of the other tourists that he meets along the way and makes friends with to go and see the sites like the Dead Sea, Marsabah, and Bethlehem, which were the same sites that Melville himself visited in 1856. Their journey story involves bandits and thieves, death and mysticism, introspection, and a lot of religious and existential discussion. The poem is written in 4 parts, totaling about 150 cantos, and in round figures is 18,000 lines long. For some scale, that is almost double the length of Paradise Lost. Unlike Paradise Lost, which is written in blank verse, however, Melville, despite writing it 200 years later, opted for rhymed tetrameter. I will put the opening lines on the screen just to give you an idea of how it's written. Obviously, Melville is a capable storyteller, but even for readers of his day, the writing itself probably takes a little bit of time to adjust to. The plotting, however, the scale and grandeur of the narrative is impeccable. In terms of the writing itself, Melville worked on the poem for many years whilst working as a customs inspector. He intended to publish it in 1876 as somewhat of a counterpoint to all the fervent nationalism he foresaw in the coming American centennial celebrations. He intended Clarel to be the major work of the second half of his life, and into it he poured all of his hopes and fears, his sadness, his anger, his excitement at the age of wonder that was unfolding, and his terror at the past it was going to leave behind. Despite the years of writing and rewriting, despite how much of himself Melville put into the poem, his expectations for its release were suitably low. Only 350 copies were actually printed, most of them went unsold, and the remainder were burned by the publisher when they needed to make space in their warehouse. The contemporary criticism was brutal. At best, critics were confused by the poem, and at worst, they were downright cruel about it. There have been some attempts over the last 150 years to boost its reputation, but for the most part, Clarel is viewed as something of like an oddity, somewhat of a did you know kind of fact about the guy who wrote Moby Dick. I said at the start that I wanted to discuss the question of can we choose our own legacy, and I will get to that, but I want to be frank with you first. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Clarel is an easy beach read. It's not. And despite what I would tell you, epic poetry isn't exactly fashionable, and it wasn't all that different in Melville's day and age. It went out of use as a dominant mode of storytelling centuries ago, and let's just say it's somewhat of an acquired taste for the modern reader. So that aside, Clarel is also, as to be expected from Melville, highly intelligent and also beautiful. Interestingly, as time moves on, it shows a snapshot of history and culture that most readers would never get to experience otherwise, and because it's based so closely on Melville's own travels, it's somewhat of a timepiece as much as a poem. Now, despite everything I have said, Clarel is still essentially unread 150 years after its publication. Now, we don't know what Melville thought people in the future would think of his poem, but we do know how much it meant to him. He spent more than a decade writing it at a time when he knew his literary career was essentially over. Yet, he persisted. He published a tiny print run for the poem, knowing it would be essentially ignored on release, but still he persisted. He didn't do that because he was happy for it to be ignored. He persisted because, like so many other writers before and after him, he thought it was worth the struggle. He wanted Clarel to mean something for his legacy. He felt that it was his last great work. Now, we can't speak for him, but it's fair to say, I think, that in time he might have thought people would begin to appreciate the poem for what it was and see in it the things that he saw in it, which of course hasn't really happened. So what do we do with this information? Now, I can't sit here and tell you that there is some magic way to influence the future and force the generations ahead of you to value your work in the same way that you do. You cannot fight the filter of time, which is really what decides these things after all. It's like a sieve that, while you're alive, is full of all your work, but as time and generations pass after you, only the biggest works remain. The ones that mean something or speak to a time or a place or a people. It's not something that is clear until hindsight kicks in, and it is certainly not something that the writer can choose for themselves. Melville was hardly alone in this situation either. I have tossed around ideas for this video for a long time, and there are so many other writers who could have been the subject. Writers who dedicated huge parts of their life to works that are still essentially in the shadow of things they gave a lot less of themselves to. An example might be James Joyce, who spent 17 years writing Finnegan's Wake, yet will be perpetually known as the author of Ulysses. There must be hundreds of other examples, and my takeaway from this topic could equally apply to any of them. The truth is, you can't choose your legacy. You just can't. That's the conclusion for today's video. You can spend decades writing a poem and the cornerstone of your legacy still be a book you wrote in 18 months. But it also does not diminish the value of what you've written. Something can be fundamentally great, even if it's never read. And as a writer, you need to take your strength from that. You can't choose how you're remembered, but you can choose what you give your time and energy to. And if you are proud of your achievements, then job done. Because you won't be around in 200 years to know which ones people still talk about. If you focus solely on writing for publication or writing to be remembered, you stop writing for yourself. And if you can't choose what people will remember, you can at least be happy with what you make. But with all of that said, I want to end with a little bit of a sales pitch. Do you remember at the start when I talked about how magnificent Moby Dick is? Well, if a writer of Melville's caliber, capable of producing works that stand amongst the greatest writing in Western civilization, put so much emphasis on a single poem that he spent as long writing it as he spent writing all of his novels combined, then maybe, just maybe, it's worth checking out. Thank you for watching, and with essentially everything else we talk about on this channel, Clarel is out of copyright, so you can find online versions if you want to e-read it, free of charge of course, and I will throw some links into the description for anyone interested. If you have actually read the poem, first of all, congratulations. There's very few people around who have, so you can say that. Second of all, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Really keen to see what people think about this one because it is rare to find people who have got through it. That being said, love you, thank you for watching, etc. Like, subscribe to the video, all of that good stuff. There'll be more to come, so I will see you later.